Today in Aetherdrift, we get a green mythic that's just oozing potential and so much more. Let's break them down. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Aetherdrift spoilers. And we have some super sweet cards to talk about today, which means we should probably jump right into it, start talking spicy new Aetherdrift cards. Before we do, two quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can pre-order them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest previews throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk some Aetherdrift. First up today, we get a new green mythic in March of the World Ooze. So March of the World Ooze, 6 mana green enchantment, says creatures you control have base power toughness of 6/6 and are oozes in addition to their other types. And then whenever an opponent casts a spell, if it's not their turn, you get a 3/3 green elephant creature token, which is actually a 6/6 because of March of the World Ooze, and it's an ooze elephant. So this card is very interesting to me. When I first read it, I was like, okay, so this can make my little creatures really big, but it doesn't give them any evasion. Is this another preposterous proportion style card where making your creatures super huge? Yeah, I guess that's nice, but if your opponent can just chump block them, it's not always all that valuable. But there's some upside to March of the World Ooze, with the biggest being something like preposterous proportions. It's a one shot. You play it, your creatures get big for a turn. If you don't win the game, they go back to being small the next turn. March of the World Ooze, it's going to grow your creatures every single turn for as long as it sticks out, which means if you're not winning the game with it the turn you cast it, it's way better than a lot of these other overrun style effects. Plus you get this like Voice of Resurgence mode, which is kind of nice against control decks in specific. If your opponent's casting stuff during your turn, or I guess in Commander during another opponent's turn, you get some pretty big tokens out of it. So I don't think the card's that bad. In Standard, I'm just not really sure where it fits. The best use I can think of is some sort of evasive token deck where you're playing like Sanguine Evangelist, Overlord of the Mistmorts, these cards that put flying tokens on the battlefield. So you make some bats, you make some insects, and then you just drop March of the World Ooze. Suddenly, all those little flyers become 6/6s, and you just one-shot your opponent with a single attack. The biggest downside of March of the World Ooze is that it doesn't give evasion, but if you play things that are evasive anyway, that's not actually that much of a downside. The big problem I see with this card is we're just in a Standard meta that's very prepared for enchantments because of Unholy Annex, because of the Overlords, because of Caretaker's Talent. There's just so many powerful enchantments in the format that most decks are going to have a plan for dealing with them. So I don't know how realistic it is to play March of the World Ooze and have it just sit out for 5 turns in a row. I imagine it's going to get this hound or destroy evil or get lost. Although, if you go for the 1-turn Alpha Strike plan we were talking about, if your opponent answers at an instant speed, well, at least they cast a spell during your turn and you get a 3/3 elephant out of it. So you get some value if it dies. I think the best home for this card, and obviously not a tier home, but really good with Slime Against Humanity, because Slime Against Humanity, not only does it care about oozes, but it shows off one of the tricks of resetting base power and toughness. So Slime Against Humanity, it makes a 0/0 ooze, and then you put a bunch of counters on it based on the number of oozes or Slimes Against Humanities that you have in exile in your graveyard, but technically it's a 0/0. So let's say you have a 0/0 ooze with 5 counters on it from Slime Against Humanity. If you drop March of the World Ooze, all of a sudden it's going to become 11/11. Its base power and toughness goes from 0/0 up to 6/6, plus you get the counters on top of that. So if you're playing a deck that has creatures with small base power and toughness, but growing them in other ways, then March of the World Ooze gets even better. In Commander, I really like the second mode on this card, the Eyes of the Wizened mode, where if you can get this down, it's going to be very annoying for your opponent to counter your spells, to be doing shenanigans during your turn. At least you get some value out of your opponent fogging you, countering you, killing your stuff at instant speed. I don't think this is a great finisher, though. If you look at the other options, Craterhoof Behemoth, obviously, like, in a tier of its own, this is nowhere close to that. At first, I was like, okay, maybe this is a Beastmaster Ascension. If you think about Beastmaster Ascension, once you get the quest counters, it gives your creatures +5/+5. If you got 1/1s and turn them into 6/6s, that's kind of +5/+5. And I could see this serving a similar purpose, but it really depends on the deck. If you're going to play March of the World Ooze, I think you either need to be an Ooze deck, or you need to be like a 1/1 1/1 token deck, something like Rin-Seri, Chatterfang, Ayula, because these are going to make a bunch of 1/1s, and then you're getting max power out of the base power and toughness resetting in March of the World Ooze. On the other hand, keep in mind, if you're playing big creatures, this gets kind of bad. Let's say you have a 8/8 on the battlefield. March of the World Ooze would actually shrink it. It would set its base power and toughness down to 6/6. So if you're playing a Go Tall deck, a Savala, a Kinnan, and Omnath, and these decks often play something like Craterhoof as a finisher, you're definitely not going to want March of the World Ooze because it might actually shrink your creatures instead of making them bigger. So March of the World Ooze, it's funny, it's flavorful. I could see standard uses. My guess is it's probably not going to make it in standard. I think that there's just probably too much enchantment hate running around for this to really be like a top tier card, but I like the flavor of this card. I can definitely see decks where it'd be really good if it sticks on the battlefield. Worst case, cool new option for Commander. We also got a new blue vehicle in Possession Engine. So Possession Engine, 5 mana for a 5/5 with Crew 3. When it enters, gain control of target creature an opponent controls for as long as you control it. That creature can't attack or block for as long as you control this vehicle. So Possession Engine, pretty interesting. Also got the Mad Max guitar guy in the art, apparently shredded out, which that was probably the best part of the new Mad Max, right? I'm pretty sure that guy just like all the things going on around him, driving down the road, just shredding on his guitar. Favorite part of that entire movie. So was this card actually good? It's basically a mind control or a mind flayer, with the twist being it's on a vehicle, which is an upside. The problem with a mind controller or mind flayer is most decks are pretty good at killing a creature if they have to, and then your opponent gets their thing back or the thing's gone altogether. Possession Engine is an artifact, might be a little bit trickier for decks to kill, so I think that's part of the card's power. It's still 5 mana, which is a lot, and it is kind of annoying that the creature can't attack or block, but it is very flavorful because you can still use it to crew the vehicle itself, although if you do crew it, then you're putting it at risk of creature removal. So there's actually a really cool amount of tension in this card. The design of the card is really, really good. Its power level, I feel like this is a limited bomb that could be like a standard sideboard card, but might be unplayable. I think the funniest thing to do with this card is just copy it a bunch of times. You play Possession Engine, and then you like 3 steps ahead, copy it, steal another creature, and then you Season of Weaving, copy it twice, and steal 2 more creatures, maybe Hulking Metamorph. It is kind of funny that you can just keep copying it, maybe steal your opponent's entire board. That does sound like a fun against the odds deck, at least. As far as actually being tournament playable in standard, though, I think it really comes down to the meta. Cards like this go up in value if a lot of decks are playing really big things. Paying 5 mana to steal an Atraxa or a Shieldred, that's actually kind of great. Even Shieldred, it can't attack or block. At least you're still getting its triggered ability. So if you're stealing something like this, then Possession Engine, really, really solid and could be a legit sideboard option. On the other hand, if you look at a lot of top tier standard decks, they're kind of tapping out at like 2 mana, 3 mana. And if you're stealing an Emberheart Challenger or Preacher of the Schism, that's just not great for 5 mana. In Commander, it's basically a vehicle deck card. In there even, I don't know if it's a staple, but if you're getting additional synergies off of it, I wouldn't play a 5 mana card that just stole one of my opponent's creatures, especially not letting that creature attack or block. But if you're playing Edward Kenaway and you get extra value out of having vehicles, or Shikori getting extra value out of vehicles, then I think Possession Engine, probably a fine option. So Possession Engine, I love the design of the card. I think it's going to play really, really well. Seems like a limited bomb, constructed kind of on the fringes, but a neat design either way. Next up, we get a new 1-drop Merfolk in Mindspring Merfolk. So a 1 mana 1/1 Merfolk Wizard. It has Exhaust of double blue and X and tap it to draw X cards and put a +1/+1 counter on each Merfolk creature you control. So Mindspring Merfolk, as its name suggests, is a Merfolk that literally has Mindspring attached to it as its exhaust ability. And then the +1/+1 counter, it's kind of like a one-shot steal overs here, I guess, for Merfolk. It is neat that, in theory, you can play this and tap it and pay 2 mana and just put a counter on your team without trying to draw cards. It's not like you need to dump a ton of mana into this to get value out of it. If you go wide enough with Merfolk, maybe just 2 mana, put a counter on everything is good enough. So Mindspring Merfolk, I think this card should be good in standard Merfolk. If you look at standard Merfolk right now, one of the biggest weaknesses of the tribe is their 1-drops kind of suck. Their best is Cenote Scout, and Cenote Scout is in green, which isn't the color you really want to be in for the most part in Standard Merfolk. The rest of Merfolk in Standard are actually pretty solid. You can see a pretty strong deck with Flood Pit Drowner, Voldaren Hexcatcher, Harbinger of the Tides, Tishana's Tideminder. Stack them all together, and you got a really powerful shell, but it's a shell that wants to be aggro, and it's missing a 1-drop. So I think that Mindspring Merfolk in Standard Merfolk fills a very important role as just being the best 1-drop Merfolk in the format. We'll see if it's enough to make Merfolk into a real deck. The question's going to be, is it worth the Merfolk payoffs of Hexcatcher and now I guess Mindspring Merfolk to play Merfolk over playing just a generic Dimir deck or whatever that already can play Tideminder and Flood Pit's Drowner? Like, is the Merfolk synergies enough to drop black and just play a bunch of Merfolk in your deck? That we're going to have to wait and see. Once you get back to older formats, I'm kind of skeptical that this card is actually going to be good enough. There's more competition once you get back to like modern Merfolk, Curse Catchers and Tide Shapers and Rashad and Dackhands. This is just a 1/1, so it gets sniped by Mo Masters. In modern, games are pretty quick. It's not like you're going to, I don't know, pay 5 mana to draw 3 cards all that often, or it's even going to live long enough for that to happen all that often. So, not saying that, yeah, you couldn't play a copy or 2 in modern Merfolk. I just don't think it's really a staple level modern Merfolk card. Also worth mentioning, if you're thinking of playing this outside of Merfolk, I'm kind of skeptical. So you could just play this as a 1-mana 1/1 for its exhaustibility of blue, X, tap, draw a bunch of cards. But we already have like Alquist Prof in Standard, which has a similar ability where you tap it to Sphinx's Revelation, and that hasn't really been good enough. So I don't know. I don't think playing this in a non-Merfolk deck is super likely, but I guess you could if you really wanted to. So Mindspring Merfolk definitely has me hyped to try building Merfolk in Standard. This might be the missing piece, or at least one of the missing pieces of the Standard Merfolk puzzle. Outside of Standard, probably not going to make the cut, but it's a 1-drop, so you never know. Next up, we get a new blue vehicle, and I think this one is actually pretty good, in Thopter Fabricator. So 3 mana for a 4/4 flying crew 2 vehicle. And then static ability. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying. So we have 2 different things going on with this card. First, Thopter Fabricator, that's like an Improbable Alliance, Mischievous Mystic, with its static ability. When you draw your second card, you get a 1/1 flyer. We've seen these effects in the past. I think Improbable Alliance was probably the most playable of them. Thopter Fabricator, it is 1 more mana compared to something like Improbable Alliance, but it has a big upside. It's also a big flying vehicle, and if you look at vehicles that are actually playable in Standard, there's 2 types. One is you have some sort of busted activated ability or enters ability like Reckoner Bank Buster, like Zika's Chariot. The other way we've seen vehicles see play is you crew cheaply and you have flying and decent stats like Ether Sphere Harvester, Heart of Kieran, Smuggler's Copter. I think that's the group that Thopter Fabricator falls into. It is crew 2 instead of crew 1, which is a downside. Although, remember, if you can make some Thopters, those can help you crew, so it kind of reduces its own crew costs in a weird way. And then having a 4/4 flyer for 3, those are pretty reasonable stats. And if you're worried about your opponent having removal, you can always not crew it. It dodges Sunfall. So I think based on its stats and its relatively low crew cost, it's already a fine card. And then you throw in the static ability on top of it, and I think you have a pretty good vehicle. The question is, where does this card fit? And I think the most likely home in Standard is probably traditional Dimir. So if your this town ain't big enough Dimir, you're probably not going to play this card. Your deck's doing something different. But if you're playing just Dimir mid-range with Fairy Masterminds and Kaidos and Enduring Curiosities, this seems to fit right in that deck, right? You got a bunch of different ways that you can draw your second card for the turn to make some Thopters. You get a flying vehicle that's going to dodge some of your opponent's removal. So I don't know how many copies you can actually fit in, but I think that's the kind of deck where Thopter Fabricator would be good. We also have a lot of card advantage edges, and this is probably more of a long shot, but Caretaker's Talent. Really good at drawing you an extra card each turn. Plus, the Thopters are a token to trigger Caretaker's Talent. Up the Beanstalk, drawing extra cards each turn. Unholy Annex, drawing extra cards each turn. If you have any of these card advantage engines on the battlefield, it is super easy to be getting a Thopter every single turn out of Thopter Fabricator. So maybe there's something there as well, but I think the card's pretty powerful. In Commander, it's almost pretty obvious. There's a bunch of different commanders that care about drawing your second card for the turn. Min Wily Illusionist, Morska, Zamonandina, Alanda, Uncommon Crom. Any of these, I think you play Thopter Fabricator, because these decks, what they're built for is drawing 2 cards, not even just during your turn, but ideally during your opponent's turn as well, and that's the easiest way to get more value out of Thopter Fabricator. If your deck is built so you're drawing 2 cards on your turn, and then 2 on your opponent's turn, and then the next opponent's turn, you're going to get a ton of value out of these cards, so I think this is an easy inclusion in the draw 2 style decks in Commander. It also could show up in some vehicle decks, like Shikori Genesis Engine. Draws cards, cares about vehicles, so I could see it slotting in there as well, or Kasima, God of the Voyage, draws extra cards, cares about vehicles, so I could see it showing up in vehicles decks, although in a dedicated vehicle deck, you might not be quite as good at making the Thopter every turn, but you get other value out of Thopter Fabricator. So Thopter Fabricator seems like a solid vehicle to me. I'm not saying it's busted or a staple or anything like that, but I think it's good enough that it can see standard play, and it's definitely got some Commander homes. We also got a couple of notable uncommons, starting with Intimidation Tactics. So 1 black mana sorcery, target opponent reveals their hand, you choose an artifact or creature card from it, exile that card, and you can cycle it for 3. So Intimidation Tactics, it's basically a twist on Dreams of Steel and Oil. So Dreams of Steel and Oil, same thing, except rather than getting to cycle as an extra upside, you also get to exile an artifact or creature from your opponent's graveyard when you cast it. In Dreams of Steel and Oil, actually sees an odd amount of play. It sees a decent amount of sideboard play in Standard, and it's even seen some Modern play. I think Intimidation Tactics, which one is better between the two is actually up for debate. It really depends on the meta. Sometimes sniping something from your opponent's graveyard going to be really relevant. On the other hand, cycling gets around one of the biggest downsides of discard, which is discard, while it's great in the early game, in the late game, once your opponent doesn't have any cards in hand, it kind of loses its value sometimes. With Intimidation Tactics, worst case, you can always cycle it away. Plus, we have some synergies for cycling, and I think worst case, even if in the short term people stick with Dreams of Steel and Oil, it's going to be rotating next rotation anyway, and then Intimidation Tactics will take over that slot most likely. But in the short term, cycling makes it better in like a Crypt Caller Chariot deck, a Marauding Marco deck. We have cards now that care about you discarding cards. In a deck like that, this is a fine discard spell that also is going to trigger some of your synergies once the game goes along. So Intimidation Tactics seems like a standard playable discard spell at least. We also got a card that I'm kind of sad they printed in Momentum Breaker. So Momentum Breaker, 2-mana enchantment, start your engines. When it enters, each opponent sacks a creature or vehicle of their choice. Each opponent who can't has to discard a card, and then you pay 2 and sack it to gain life equal to your speed. Not super relevant. So Momentum Breaker, it's an upgrade over Tithing Blade for the This Town Ain't Big Enough decks, and I think it's actually kind of a huge upgrade. So Tithing Blade, it does see some fringe play in This Town decks, but it has a pretty big problem, which is it's an artifact, and these decks really want enchantments. Enchantments are where all the synergies are, right? You're triggering your optimistic scavengers or drawing cards with your enchantresses. So just being an enchantment rather than an artifact, that's already a big upgrade, but it gets even better because this can also hit vehicles, and if your opponent doesn't have anything, then it kind of works like a hopeless nightmare where you make your opponent discard a card. So my only question for this, I think it's very, very good in the This Town Ain't Big Enough decks. My only question is, where does it fit in those decks? Those lists are pretty tight. Are you cutting Go for the Throat for it? Like, I don't think you can cut Nowhere to Run. You can't cut the Hopeless Nightmares. You can't cut the This Downs. So finding room for it might be a challenge. But I think just card for card, Momentum Breaker, huge, huge upgrade over Tithing Blade. And I do think we'll see it in these self-bound style decks. It's kind of funny. I'm pretty sure Wizards did not expect these decks to be so good. I honestly think the Wizards thought This Town Ain't Big Enough was going to be like a janky limited card rather than one of the best cards in Standard. I think if they knew that This Town Ain't Big Enough was going to be like the best thing going in Standard, I don't know if they'd print a card like Momentum Breaker, but that's the world we live in, and I think that Momentum Breaker probably going to find its way into the 75 of the self-bound stacks, if not in the main deck, at least in the sideboard, and I think some number probably show up in the main. It's that big of an upgrade over Tithing Blade. Otherwise, we got a bunch of lower rarity stuff that you can check out over on MTGPreviews.com, including a new Lord for mounts and some vehicles, and Moltender, which actually seems kinda reasonable as a 1-mana mana dork in a deck that can fill the graveyard aggressively. But anyway, check it all out over at MTGPreviews.com. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Aetherdrift spoilers for today. So, which card from today is your favorite? What are you thinking about this the set, let me know in the comments, and I'll be back tomorrow with another one. Until then, have a lovely day, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? We can find yesterday's spoiler video here, or maybe check out the Against the Odds where we tried to play mono green control in Standard.